The evolutionary timeline is always shifting, always changing. Hey, throw around some millions here, throw around some millions there. And tonight we're going to be talking about a proposed major shift in the human evolutionary timeline. Now, evolution is false. And I like to give you scientific reasons to reject evolution. And there are many scientific reasons to reject evolution. Tonight, what I'm going to be talking about, I would call it more like nitpicking, because the timeline issue is always shifting, is something we should pay attention to. It's not one of my major reasons for rejecting evolution, but it does annoy me because so often we are taught very dogmatically that, hey, we know this about human origins. I mean, how many times we know humans emerged from Africa, and we have all these timelines that are given to us that, well, we know because of the genetic evidence, blah 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 blah. And there's lots of reasoning given, but then just a simple jawbone can shift the entire timeline. So that's what I want to talk about, because recently there was a skull that has been dated at something like 1 million years old that has been uh, reconstructed and would shift the human evolutionary timeline past 1 million years. That's like tripling our current age of Homo sapiens. Okay, so this is a huge shift. So this came out just a few months ago. I saw this headline: scientists reconstruct 1 million-year-old skull and suggest it could rewrite our timeline of human evolution. Now, if you pay attention to headlines about evolution, this kind of stuff happens all the time. And so, anyway, in this article, they say now this skull, known as Youngzhan 2, challenges the view that they had about, when Denisovians, Neanderthals, Homo sapiens split. Okay, so they found that this skull's geological age is likely around 1 million years old. And given the age of the fossil, the researchers propose that the Denisovians and modern humans last shared a common ancestor about 1.32 million years ago, while the Neanderthals diverged about 1.38 million years ago. That's a big change, Chris Stringer, a paleoanthropologist at the Natural History Museum in London and a study co-author, it tells the Washington Post. So, yeah, so this is a big deal, and it's right now it's just there. This isn't like official doctrine, but this would really triple the age of Homo sapiens. And so I picked this out of the article because I thought this is interesting. They said, that this skull is thought to be too old for its DNA to be intact. So they're not trying to test its DNA. But we have previously thought things were too old to have DNA. And then lo and behold, we found DNA in them, like Neanderthals, Denisovians. And so, this, we should pay attention when they're not doing something because they have an assumed age in their mind. And this happens a lot in evolution. They even change dates, and I'm going to get to that pretty soon. They will change. If you think radioisotope dating is like this firm thing that you can trust and that, hey, it's just hard science, well, just watch how they'll change the dates when the radioisotope dating doesn't match their idea about how old the fossil should be. So this says, well, this skull is, if it's indeed a member of the Longi-Denisovian clade, this necessarily pushes back the minimum age of that clade to at least 1 million years. Either way, he says, this fossils like Youngzhan 2 show us how much we still have to learn about our origins. Yeah, so before one of these big changes, they're always like, well, we know from our genetic studies and from fossil evidence that these bones are this old, or that this group emerged at this time. And then something like this comes out and they're just like, well, I guess we just need to learn more about our origins. Well, then don't dogmatically teach the first timeline because it does shift all the time. And so here's just another article, very similar article, same thing. So the main thing is, now this skull that they reconstructed is not Homo sapiens, it's Homo longi. And this is our what they're calling like a sister species, right? Like all of these, and you notice from this article, they talk about that these may replace Neanderthals as our closest relatives found in China. So if anybody out there is thinking, oh, we just have so much evidence for humans evolving from ape-like ancestors, actually, most of what we find just looks like humans. Okay, so they end up calling them our sister species or something like that. Neanderthal was supposed to be in our genetic, the an ancestor. Now it's like we lived contemporaneously with them, and so there's all these skulls and fossils that we're finding that really just look like humans. Like you wouldn't know if they were like sitting on the bus next to you or something like that. You would not know that this, was a human ancestor according to the evolutionary story. So, congratulations if this turns out to be true. Homo sapiens, you just tripled in age. And the timeline, this isn't the only time that the human timeline has proposed a shift. In fact, just in 2017, the Homo sapiens age got pushed back 100,000 years. So if you remember back when they used to say, 200,000 years was when Homo sapiens came along. Well, in 2017, that changed to 300,000 years. But anyway, if this, skull and that they continue to look at this, the new proposed timeline would, put Homo sapiens at 1,000,000 years old. Now, this is the fossil that they found in Morocco, 2017. This is the research that basically pushed back to the Homo sapien timeline to 300,000 years. And there's some stuff on that. Now, this also wasn't the only time the human timeline has changed. In fact, there's been a lot of changes both to the dates and just the arguments that have come about, the dates to the timeline, but also the dating methods that they use. They will adjust them. And a great book that talks about this is Contested Bones by Chris Roop and John Sanford. Okay, so this one example that he gives in the book of how flexible these dates are with the radioisotope dating and the other dating methods that they use when they find these fossils. Okay, the KBS tuff in Kenya, Ethiopia, it first dated, when they first dated this, it came out with potassium argon radioisotope dating. With potassium argon dating, it came out to 221 million years old. But the researchers were like, no, it can't be that old, right? Because obviously the wrong fossils are there, right? We're supposed to be in dinosaur land here, and there's all these, mammal bones and hominids. So we can't have this KBS tuff being 221 million years old. So they were like, okay, well, it must be contamination. And you can read about this in a Nature article from 1970. I put the source up there. But basically, they ended up doing more dating methods, and they came out with a date that was better for their human evolution timeline, which was 2.6 million years ago. And so they were satisfied with that. And they had all these dating methods that supposedly aligned with each other that said 2.6 million years ago. Well, then a little oopsie happened because they found a Homo skull below that tuff. And they were like, okay, well, that doesn't fit with our evolutionary timeline. These dates must be wrong. So again, their dating methods were very flexible because they went back to the drawing board and tried to get some radioisotope dates and other dating methods that would fit better with what they think our ancestry is. So they came back and they said, okay, it's like 1.8. And even then they were arguing about 1.8, 1.6. And so all of these arguments took place to try to get dates that would work for their idea of human origins. And so that just goes to show you, and this is not an isolated incident. You can find issues like this with radioisotope dating in just many studies. In fact, there was a study that kind of went through all the radioisotope dating in the database, and that in our US national database, and found that many of those dates did not align when they dated with multiple methods. So if you have been concerned about radioisotope dating, I will say it's a hard thing to try to figure out, but it's one of those things when you start looking into it, you'll realize that these dates are often cherry picked. And I have a guest that's going to come on, so I'll let him on in a minute. So I am looking forward to that. But I wanted to let you know, this isn't the only thing in the evolutionary timeline that shifted this year. Okay, earlier in 2025, this article came out shifting the tetrapod timeline by like 35 million, 40 million years. Now, how does that shift? Well, they found these little tracks that are in a rock layer that's supposed to be, 35 million, 40 million years older than they expected to find these tracks, according to the idea of tetrapod evolution. So, now we've moved 40 million years in just because of one little artifact. Now the reason this also bothers me is because if you talk to people who are into this, people who are deeply into evolution and looking at the genetics, they will do these molecular divergence dates, and they will say, based on the genetics, we know that such and such animal had a common ancestor at such and such time. And so we know that from looking at their genetics. Well, what happened to the genetics with this? You can just throw out your 40 million years based on one little rock that's found with some tracks. So, this gives you a good reason to be skeptical with all of the different dating methods that are being used to try to establish timelines for evolution and for human timeline and others. And that's really what I had to say. So I will bring Dustin on to talk about this. And if anybody else wants to join after Dustin comes on, you're welcome to join and share your thoughts.
How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Oh, I'm excellent. See, there's a fundamental issue when you're talking about evolution and science. You see, science is empirical. This is why the evolutionist gets stuck in never-ending descriptions without any explanation. And I believe that that's the point that everybody seems to miss, is that there's never an explanation um, for essentially anything, because humans are supposed to be related to chimpanzees. But did you know that if you try to transplant a heart from a chimpanzee to a human, it won't take? We can do
Yeah.
it with pigs, but we can't do it with chimpanzees. We can't do it with gorillas or orangutans, monkeys. It's been tried by Russians, and it has failed every single time. So the premises for a transplant is two people being related is the best chances for a transplant to take. Now, I believe the best odds are if they're a closer relative, say sister or father, and that's the best chances that you have at not having to take immunosuppressants for the rest of your life. However, a third party can be implemented, but it's left to immunosuppressants for the rest of their lives. But in the case of the chimpanzee, 100% of the time, it's tissue rejection. Every single time. But when we turn to pigs, most of the time it's just a course of immunosuppressants for the rest of their lives. So if we're so closely related, why are we able to accept pig parts, but we're not able to take monkey hearts?
That is a great point. I love that because pigs are far from us on the evolutionary tree, right? So, you know, and the apes don't share those commonalities that the reasons that we're choosing the pigs, the apes don't share those. So it's a problem for their idea about human evolution.
Correct. Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? I'm looking at that. I'm like, wait a second here. So we're so closely related. I don't know.
Yeah.
And they say that the reason, see, and that's the other thing is Erica was saying the other day that, um, what was it? It was I lost it. Never mind. You were going to say something?
No, I wasn't. I no. But yeah, I was just waiting to hear what you were going to say.
Um, she
Okay, was
said
it
something.
something about chimps and human common ancestry?
Well,
Okay, think about
it's
it.
just that when like phenotype and genotype, right? So if we're not even phenotypically similar to chimpanzees, right? Not really. I mean, if you think about it, our feet aren't designed to grab things. Um,
Totally agree. When people look at like I know so many people who like get rattled about evolution, like they feel like it must be true because they think chimps look like humans and I'm like, where are you getting that? Like where does that come from? I don't see that. Like I see an animal. It's just I mean, they have some similar features, but I mean, it's just I don't find that compelling.
well, I mean, yeah, relation, and that's the other thing is that if we split from a common ancestry, how does the chimpanzee have more genetic material in the form of chromosomes? I wouldn't you think that, coming from a common ancestor that we would have the exact same number of set, but for whatever reason, supposedly the chimpanzee picked up more chromosomes.
Yeah, well, they have the whole chromosome 2 fusion thing. So,
Yeah. And then suspiciously humans just break a gene and we can no longer synthesize our own vitamin C. It's just, have you even looked at some of the Y chromosome comparisons? Like if you ever go look at Donnie Badinsky's work.
yes. Yep, I'm very familiar with that because and he talks about that like the Y chromosome is only like 30% similar between a chimpanzee and a human.
Well, and that's another thing is that she'll argue that evolution is entirely species wide. But every time she's brought back to trying to show an example of evolution, she'll point at a singular set of bones. We can see the example in the singular, but it applies for the plural. How do you know that that's not a particular case with like a defect of birth? You don't know that. There's no way to know that. How would you know?
Yeah, in general, a there is not good evidence for evolution. There's very weak evidence that is presented. And if you really get down to it, you'll find that a lot of the evidence that's given for evolution is religious in nature. And I did not even realize that until uh, Cornelius Hunter started talking to me about it and I read his books and now I see it everywhere. So it's it's deeper than people think. You can say really scientific sounding things, but some of the starting assumptions to try to build the case for evolution are deeply theological.
I can use, okay, for example, there's no real person that completely understands how a transistor works, right? We know how it works by description. We have to take it on faith that these things working in concert allows for us to affect a change that we wanted to affect. So I'm speaking here, you hear me there, and I'm told that that is based on the technology that is known as the transistor. From inference and example, I am forced to accept their explanation. They have no inference or example that is an analog that directly emulates that specific example at
Interesting.
all. They nothing. They have no experiment, right? And that's another thing is with this replication crisis, like the theory of relativity, for example. The one thing that they never took into consideration as they were measuring the difference in starlight by the supposed bend of curve of gravity of the sun is that there's also an immense magnetic field that can cause the light to bend. Didn't take that into consideration.
Dustin, what's your background with this? What got you
I'm a
interested in this topic?
I'm a roofer that got sick and tired of being lied to. Doesn't
Cool.
get any simpler than that. But I
Nice.
saw a few of your shows, and I'm very impressed with your work, and will be continuing to watch. And I hope to have the opportunity to speak to you again.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I appreciate your support and thanks for coming on.
Have a great night,
You
Rebecca.
too. All right, so let's go to the comments and see what's going on over here. And greetings to everyone. And I'll just put my reasons to reject evolution up on the screen, and I will talk about those if nobody else joins me. But let's just say hello to some people. Not Evolution says evolution evolves because it needs to. Yes, it has to, because once one thing gets shown not to be true, then it has to move on to the next thing. But unfortunately, it's never really questioned. The entire theory is never really questioned seriously in scientific and academic circles. Richie says, have you read Probability Zero? Reading now, super good so far. No, I have not. Okay, so Laser Fan says, unless you assume that isotopes can magically decay hundreds or thousands of times faster than they have been observed to. Okay, so now I will say that first of all, there has been some work done that has shown that decay rates are variable, and not just by, people who reject evolution, but also secular work. And I'm trying to think, was it at Stanford? A Stanford scientist found decay rates, and I have to look that up for you. I don't have that reference off the top of my head. I have it here in my file, so I guess I could pull it out. In fact, why don't I? Let me just find it for you because I want to back up what I'm saying. So, yeah, this is basically P.A. Sturrock. And so this is from 2011, and the article is called Further Evidence Suggestive of a Solar Influence on Nuclear Decay Rates. So that's really interesting. And so there's the decay rates may not always be certain. Also, there are sometimes, assumptions made that there is no daughter product present at the beginning. And actually, we have lots of evidence for certain types of radioisotope dating that is not true. And potassium argon is one of those where, we assumed that it wouldn't have argon, but in fact it does. And that causes the dates to be inflated. There's lots of examples of potassium argon and argon being used to date events that we know the history of, like volcano eruptions that we know the history of, we know when they erupted, and that the dating giving inflated dates by millions of years. So I don't think I have a complete answer for all radioisotope dating methods, but there are many that are problematic, and they might all be problematic. And so more work needs to be done on that. But yeah, so let's see what else. Frank says the only way to convince me that the human timeline is older than 8,000 years is to find a library with books, stories, and poems dating earlier than that. Show me the poem written in 10,000 BC. Yeah, it's really interesting because our earliest writing dates back something like 5,000 years. So there's no writing before that. There, you see this explosion of human civilization around that time period in all kinds of ways. And so it as well as the explosion of population itself. So the population growth, the evidence of civilization, it does not go well with the evolutionary timeline. And so I think it fits much better with the idea of the Bible, the global flood. And a lot of people question that. A lot of people think that people like me are crazy for believing that. But the thing is that, you know, I am not someone who started dogmatically, and I'm not dogmatic now. I truly believe the Bible story because I think it's the best explanation. Now there are some things that are, I will say don't seem to fit into that timeline or that version of history. Right now, I don't have all the pieces to the puzzle. There are some things that kind of like don't seem to make sense with that. But like there's a lot that does make sense with it. And so that's the story that I believe. And I'm glad to see that I have somebody joining. Hey, Dr. Feldman, how are
Hello.
you?
I'm fine. Let me, the lighting looks terrible. Let me see if I can adjust a little. Well, I can't. Maybe that works.
Good to
Yeah.
see you.
Yep, good to see you too. So I tuned in a little bit late, but I saw your discussion of the footprint, so I just wanted to address that. And, as new evidence comes to light, of course, the timeline changes and it pushes things back. But the new evidence doesn't really contradict anything that was done previously that I'm aware of. If you think it contradicts the genetic timeline, I'd like to see that evidence that says the genetics says that the footprints must be too old or something.
Oh,
But
the tetrapod footprints?
the tetrapod footprints, yes, sorry, I should have, yes. So I'm
Yeah.
aware that for several of the groups, for several of the groups of fossils, we have footprints first and then the body fossils. For terrestrial fossils especially, you can see, getting the right kind of taphonomic conditions to preserve body fossils is maybe tougher than footprints. But what's interesting to me is, sorry, I need to bring up a diagram that I'm working on. It's not quite ready for prime time, but what's interesting to me isn't just that there's footprints now, tetrapod footprints that are a little bit older than the body fossils. And 40 million years, of course, is a lot of time. But if you look at the total amount of time of the evolution of complex life, it's actually not that much. And so it just pushes it back about half a period in terms of time. But what's impressive to me is the complete lack of footprints in the Precambrian or Cambrian or Ordovician or Silurian. Even though the taphonomic conditions are fine for preserving footprints, we see raindrop imprints in all those times. We see current ripples preserved. There's no reason why footprints wouldn't have been preserved, but nobody in the Precambrian, no one's ever found a footprint or a bone or a tooth or a scale or a fish in the Precambrian. And if that's pre-flood, it should have been populated with all those animals or plants. No one's ever found a leaf fossil in the Precambrian or roots.
Well, I'm glad you're here because, I'm starting to think that Kent Hovind might have been right when he said they date the rocks by the fossils and the fossils by the rocks. So I'm starting to suspect, and I'll give you my reason why, okay, that they are looking at layers. When these layers got dated, it's because of what they are finding in them. And even just last night when I was and so if they found, the things that you're describing in the Precambrian, they wouldn't call it the Precambrian,
That's
right?
not
Like,
that's not true. So,
okay,
for example, there's the Precambrian at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and so there's no way to make that not Precambrian. It just can't happen. And
well,
so
they
below,
do it though. They do it with things like intrusions, right? Like, oh, it's an intrusion.
well, intrusions don't really happen in sedimentary rocks. There's one minor way they can happen, but that's not a thing in sedimentary rocks. I mean, they're all layered on top of each other, and the layers are, you can't deposit a layer in the middle. You have to deposit them in order. There are some things called injectites. Sedimentologically, they cannot be confused with bedded material. I've seen injectites many times. So that what you're saying there can't really isn't really a thing. But let me. This is something I've actually been working on, and I'm prepared to talk about that. Kent Hovind is absolutely wrong, and all the creationists who say that biostratigraphy is circular is wrong, and they're wrong for good reasons. This has been worked on quite a bit. So let's start with, how do you think, when we say rocks are Devonian or Ordovician or whatever, how do you think we know that? Like, what's the basis for making that call? I'm just curious what you think.
That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Okay, well, I'll tell you.
Wait, but let me give you my example, and I want to hear what you would say to this.
Okay, sure.
Okay, and then I want to hear your explanation of how they do know. But
Okay.
like last night when I was preparing for this, and I was reading, in Contested Bones, and seeing how they first dated the KBS tuff at 221 million years by potassium argon dating. Okay. Then that was rejected. Now they came up with reasons. Of course, they're going to say, oh, well, it was contaminated or whatever. Okay. But the reason is that date is rejected is because of the types of fossils that are found in that layer. Okay. So they had to find a reason to reject that date. But let's just suppose that they found in that layer what would go along with the evolutionary timeline of 221 million years. Then would they have, still found that potassium argon was contaminated, or would that still be our date that we're using right now? Because they say, no, potassium argon dating, it's good, it's radioisotope dating, this has to be right, and we know it's 220 million years old. So, like, explain the thinking to me. How are we getting these dates and knowing for sure if it's not by what is found in the layer?
So I can't speak to that. I've never heard of this tuff before, so I can't speak to that example. If you send me the the citations about this, I'll look into it. But the way biostratigraphy actually works is, when we say something is Devonian or Ordovician or whatever, there's a type location where that boundary is specified, and there's a lat long, and it'll say, the type boundary for the base of the Devonian is in this location, and it's the bed that is so many meters above the key limestone, and it's at the base of some biostratigraphic zone like Monograptus, whatever it is for the Devonian. And so it's all based on type locations, and the type location specifies the boundary of, say, the base of the Devonian or the base of the Ordovician or whatever. It's usually the bases that are used for boundaries, but it doesn't matter if it's the base or top. And then they always pick a marine stratigraphic section because that has lots of fossils in it. And then the fossils are used to correlate that out from the type area. So the fossils, the biostratigraphic fossils, are used to correlate. And there's a lot of effort that is put into biostratigraphy. Biostratigraphy is how we know something is Devonian or Ordovician or Cretaceous. It's through biostratigraphy. And in the Cretaceous, for example, when I was working, and I still consult some, but when I was working, we wouldn't even talk about the Cretaceous. We'd talk about, say, the Albian, and then we'd have maybe 5 biostratigraphic zones within the Albian, which is one small stage within the Cretaceous, and there'll be biostratigraphic zones in that. And so the biostratigraphic zones are all worked out in the type location. So the reason that people are wrong when they say biostratigraphy is circular is because the fossils that are used to date the rocks are different than the fossils that are dated by the rocks they're in. So that breaks the circularity. So there's absolutely no circularity in biostratigraphy. The order in which we see the fossils is the same worldwide. Now there are local fossils that only occur in one area, like Tyrannosaurus rex only occurs in Western North America. It doesn't occur anywhere else. But there's so many fossils, and typically for biostratigraphy, we like to use marine plankton, and it would be a lot of groups you've probably never heard of, graptolites and ostracods, forams, conodonts, coccoliths, and a lot of these, especially coccoliths, are distributed almost worldwide. So when you see the order of species, you can go to sites that are 1,000 miles apart, and the order of the species will be the same. It's exactly the same. Now, there might be species that are missing in any one place because of erosion, so you have an unconformity. And so there is, when Kent Hovind says there's we date the fossils by the rocks and the rocks by the fossil, and it's all circular, that shows a profound lack of understanding of how biostratigraphy actually works. And so when we're trying to figure out the ages of sedimentary rocks, I'm not talking about the millions of years, I'm talking about the assigned ages of Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, and so on. And it's not even Cambrian, it's like it'll be a little tiny slice of the Cambrian. In the Cretaceous, there's maybe, I don't know, 60, 70 biostratigraphic zones just within the Cretaceous. So we can get, really finely controlled time in terms of relative time. And so all of these names, all of these periods, Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, were set. They were set 100 years before there was any radiometric dating. So they're not. It has nothing to do with radiometric dates. It is not circular. The people that say that just don't understand how it works or how it's done. When that I used to work for an oil company, and I did that for 26 years. And every time we drilled an exploration well, we'd send out samples for biostratigraphy. And so, and it's real money that we're talking about. I don't know how much it is today, but probably $100,000 to $200,000 to run biostrat for an oil well in the offshore. And that was the gold standard for determining the age, not radiometric dates. Now, the way the radiometric dates work is if you find a biostratigraphic boundary, and then you have a volcanic ash above it and a volcanic ash below it, you'll date the volcanic ashes, and that'll give you the age of the boundary. And so, there are times, like in my lifetime, the boundary of the base of the Cambrian has shifted in terms of absolute dates because better information was collected. But the actual surface in the rocks of where that boundary is didn't shift at all because it was based on biostratigraphy. And in the Cambrian, it's trilobites, the first appearance of trilobites. So somewhere in the world, I don't know, there's actually an app you can get. I've got it on my phone where it tells you exactly where the type section is and lat long, and you can go there, and these type sections are publicly accessible so that anybody can go there and collect the fossils and study the biostratigraphy. But that's how these zones are dated. And so the biostratigraphic age of a zone, like calling something Albian, which would be in the, I'm looking at my cheat sheet here so I don't make a mistake. So the Albian would be the latest early Cretaceous. the boundary of these zones shouldn't change unless you get better biostrat data. But the ages in absolute years can change because you get better, more constrained dates. And so whenever you say the date is such, you should always follow it by plus or minus whatever that plus or minus is. And they're always reported with a plus or minus. And that plus or minus is important. Now, like, again, I don't know anything about this tuff that you're talking about. I've never heard of it before. But, I don't think it's a problem that new information comes to light that forces you to reevaluate it. I think if people are evaluating the dates based on the biostratigraphy, that's, bad science, and I would reject that. I've never seen that done, but I haven't used radiometric dates very much in my work. I've used biostratigraphy a lot. So this is something I've got professional expertise in, so I know how biostratigraphy works. And the idea that, we decide, like some geologists back in the 1850s decided what the order of fossils is and then forced it to fit the biostratigraphy or somehow, that's absurd. In England, what they did is they measured through the section, and there's a pretty thick stratigraphic section that's preserved in England because the beds are tilted a little bit relative to the land surface. So as you walk around the land, you're looking at successively younger beds. And so this was worked on, all the geologists that did this at the beginning were in Europe. And so a lot of the type sections are in Europe because of that. But a lot of the type sections have been moved because they would find in retrospect there was an unconformity where they put the type section in. So you want, continuous deposition so you're not missing any of the biozones. But there's no circularity in it. There is no forced order. The order is the order. And so, like in the Grand Canyon, you can walk up, the entire section from the Cambrian to the Permian. There's some unconformities, but everything is in order. You can't force something in the Permian to be earlier than something in the Cambrian because you could visually see the order. And the same thing in, just about any place you go in the world. It may not be as obvious as the Grand Canyon, but it's still, the order is what is observed. It is not forced. And so I'm not that, let me just say one more thing. I'm not that familiar with the human evolution part of it because that's not
that's fine.
my job. But when you get into the older stuff, I'm very familiar with it. And there's no a priori assumption about what the order must be. It's just what is observed in the rock record.
Yeah, I'm like bursting with questions I want to ask you because I recently found out something in Utah, and I know geology in Utah, so I want to ask you that. But there's also two comments that I want to bring up and see how you respond to these. So Wes says they came up with the old ages before they came up with the dating method. They based the ages on the rocks.
That is patently false. There was some indications that the Earth must be ancient due to the physical observations of stratigraphy. One of the big revealing outcrops was something called Sicker Point, and you can look it up. It's an unconformity where you've got a series of beds dipping like this, and you've got an unconformity with beds then horizontal on top of it. And that convinced that was one of the first outcrops where that had been seen. It's been seen now in many places around the world, but that convinced a lot of the early skeptics when they were taken to that. And you could only get to it by boat at the time. It's still kind of a hike to get there. I've never been there myself, but there's lots of pictures online where you can see that. And so the idea is to get that Sicker Point to happen, you had to have beds that were deposited horizontally and then cemented, and then the beds were folded and then eroded off, and then new beds deposited on top, and then those were cemented. And the idea is that you can't do that in a few thousand years. There's not enough time to bury and to fold and cement the beds and fold them, whatever order it happened in, and then erode them off. And so the physical evidence kept accumulating for an ancient Earth. But before radiometric dating, nobody had any idea that the base of the Cambrian was 570 whatever million years it is. That came after radiometric dating. And if anybody says that's not true, that it came first, then show me the evidence. Show me a publication where somebody said it in print or it's in some sort of documented example where they came up with the ages first and then force fit the radiometric dates. As far as I know, that has never, ever happened. And the people who say it's happened never can show an example of who set the dates first before radiometric dates. Now, what is true is that the early radiometric dates had a lot of uncertainties to them. The techniques got better with time. I'm not an expert on radiometric dates, and I use the radiometric scale in my work occasionally, but I'm not an expert on it. What I do know is from looking at stratigraphy, and I am an expert on stratigraphy. I've got 2 books out now. I had 1 book before, and I've got a 2nd book out. I've almost got a 3rd book out. When we look at stratigraphy, we see all the features that creationists say shouldn't be there if the Earth is young. We see beautiful weathered soils and unconformities. We see river valleys embedded in the rocks that shouldn't be there if everything happened 4,000 years ago. And river valleys can't form underwater. It's a myth that that terrestrial fossils are always mixed with marine fossils. That's not true. It happens in a few places, but the vast majority of terrestrial fossils, like dinosaur bones and such, are not mixed with marine fossils in the vast majority of cases. And
Right. Well, I mean, you wouldn't have to have, for the flood, you wouldn't have to have marine fossils everywhere. But I mean, we do find marine fossils like, top of mountains. We find marine fossils in places like center of continents and places that you really wouldn't expect them.
why would you not expect them?
Well, because well, it gets a little confusing when you start talking about the continents, because actually the continents, even though, this continent should have been here like 200 million years, but it should have been eroded.
Way longer than that.
Okay, I'm getting too far off track though with this, because I want to get the other person's comment up here, but we can have a longer conversation about that later.
You set the order.
Okay, cool. This person said, so buck around and find out, says, ask him about what happened with Mount St. Helens in that dating the whole thing.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like I said, radiometric dates aren't really my specialty, so I'm not familiar with that. Yeah. But
and that's the thing, is like a lot, but I mean, like, do you agree? Like, when we look at what happened at Mount St. Helens, a lot of the formations that geologists say, it would have to take millions of years to form. Put the dating aside if you don't want to talk about that. Let's talk about the formations, the rock formations, the canyon, the everything that happened as a result of the Mount St. Helens eruption, and how it formed structures that geologists would have said those take millions of years to form.
Oh, that's not true. There's no structures I've seen in the photographs of Mount St. Helens that geologists would say take millions of years to form. I know that's repeated a lot by creationists, but it's a big myth. It's just not true. So there's some, I've seen creationists stand in front, say, well, here's laminations at Mount St. Helens, and geologists say laminations. Yeah, I'm not sure what that's a picture of.
Okay. Well, I mean, and I'm just opening up to a random page in here. So, but like, there apparently this whole canyon formed.
Yeah, that's.
And then you have, so.
Yeah. So,
there's layers, there's rock layers, just like they would say these millions of years took millions of years. There's stratified rock layers.
Nobody says that rock layers need to take millions of years to form. I mean, that's just a myth that creationists have completely made up. There are lots of processes that form rocks very quickly. Limestone forms exceedingly quickly. We know that there's limestone with Coke bottles embedded in the middle of the limestone, and so it had to form after Coke bottles. I mean, and there's been lots and lots of documentation of this. Some rock types absolutely take millions of years to form. Coal and quartz cemented sandstone, which is the most common type of sandstone, you cannot form that in 6,000 years. But other rock types absolutely can form rapidly, limestone being principal among them. And so we know that limestone sets up exceedingly fast. I mean, I remember one of my colleagues at work, we would take geologists down to the Bahamas to study limestone. And he said there was a hurricane that created this huge sandbar of carbonate, like shell debris and oolites and things. And he went back the next year and it was solid rock. So that's, being cemented in 1 year. And that's absolutely consistent with what we understand. And so what creationists have done, there's tons of videos that show this. Some creationists will go up to an upright fossil tree. I'm sure you've seen this. And they'll say, those silly geologists say it took millions of years to bury this upright tree. How silly. And they all laugh about it, except they can never find a geologist who's ever said that. No one has ever said that. No one has said that sediments need to take millions of years to form. They can, but they don't have to. And all of the evidence for rapid deposition that creationists used, all of it, was first discovered by geologists decades ago, and then co-opted by creationists who then claim the geologists aren't familiar with this evidence. I mean, it's just absurd. So I've got,
Yeah.
let me just say one more thing, and then you can take it off. I worked at the Kansas Survey for several years, and I remember I was working on this one deposit that had these upright trees, fossil trees. I mean, this is solid rock. These are extinct types of trees and things. And there was a publication from 1963, I think it was. And the geologist who was a stratigrapher at the Kansas Survey said in 1963 that depositional rate had to be fast enough to bury the trees before they had time to rot. And that was the interpretation in 1963. And it's never changed. And so no one has ever said it takes millions of years for these things to form. And so creationists need a boogeyman. So what they do is they make up things about what geologists think. And this is what infuriates me, is I see this all the time. And so it just gets me, and I see it in videos that have been released in the last few months. It's just insane. And they never can actually find a geologist who said these things that they're making up. And so I just see so much, false statements. And I think the people who are making these videos have a moral responsibility to see that what they're saying is true, rather than just repeating what they've seen on other people's videos and what they've seen in creationist books. Okay, I'm done.
Well, I mean, and that's the issue is, how do we find out what is true? But
Read
I
the
mean,
list.
so but you mentioned the coal taking a long time to form.
Okay.
I feel like I saw a thing at a creationist conference where they had formed coal like very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that can happen. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So then how do you know coal takes millions of years to form? If we can form it quickly, how do you know it took millions of years to form?
Fair question. And of course I've heard this before. So here's why. To get coal to form, you need pressure and heat. And so the temperature, I think it's about 200 C to get high grade coal, like anthracite coal, which is the highest grade coal. And so the problem is you have to bury it to get the pressure. And so in the creationist model, you can do that rapidly, right? But the heat is the problem. Now we know how fast heat propagates through rocks. This is something you can measure in the laboratory. And we know that as you go down in, like drill down in an oil well or something, it gets hotter and hotter, or a coal mine or whatever. The deeper you go, the hotter it gets. But where did that heat come from? Well, it ultimately came from the mantle and is propagating up through conduction, through heat conduction, through the rocks. And that's what takes the time. And that's why you can't form coal rapidly, because there's no way to speed up that process without a miracle. I mean, if you're going to say, there was a miracle that heated up the rocks, yeah, then you can form coal fast. But if you're going to say, no, this is all natural processes without a miracle, then you cannot form coal fast. You can form the peat, and you can form you can bury it to get the pressure, but what you can't do is heat it up quickly, because heat propagates through rocks very slowly. And so to get the kinds of temperatures that you need, and that heat is ultimately propagating up from the mantle. I mean, that's the ultimate source of the heat, is just takes time. And in some cases, you've got kilometers of rock or miles of sedimentary strata to get through to heat it up. And so you're not just heating up that one coal seam, you've got to heat up the whole volume of rock. And you're talking about thousands of cubic miles of rock that are heated up. It's a tremendous amount of energy, and so you just can't do that quickly.
Well, is it possible that conditions could have been different? Like the conditions now, maybe it happened slowly, but the conditions could have been different.
Well, what conditions? I mean, we know how fast heat propagates through rock, and so are you going to say the physical properties of sandstone, the density was different in the past, or the density of quartz was different in the past than it is today, or the heat conductivity of quartz was different in the past than today? You'd have to change, some pretty fundamental physics, like at the atomic level. I don't know how you would do that. I guess, again, with a miracle.
Well, then how are they making the coal? If we can rapidly form pieces of coal right now, how is that happening?
Well, you have an electric heater, so you can generate the heat to heat that small bit. But you can't, that's heating a small volume is very easy. Heating thousands of cubic miles of rock is not. And so that's the problem, is heating the rock to get the coal up to the temperature it needs to get to form coal. And we've got measures. We know from the temperature it takes to make the hydrocarbons today, you can just put things in an oven and see how hot did it have to get to do that. There's also certain phosphatic fossils that are altered in their color at certain temperatures, and there's also something called vitrinite reflectance. So we've got several different independent measures of what the high temperature reached by the rock was. And then what's the physical process? Well, we know what the physical process is. There's no other process. You have to have the heat propagating from below. We know this is what happened because as you drill down, it gets hotter and hotter. So that means the heat source is underneath, because heat moves from hot to cold, right? So the heat is constantly moving up from below. And we know the rate at which this happens. This is something that can be measured today, but you can also measure it in the lab just by heating a piece of rock and see how long it takes for the heat to propagate. And you just can't propagate the heat in 6,000 years to generate either the coals that we see today or the temperature profile. So every time, it's very common, I shouldn't say every time, but it's very common when oil wells are drilled that they'll measure the temperature at the base of the well. And so we know what the temperature is in these basins, and we know it down miles. And so you just can't achieve those temperatures, the temperature profiles, the heat flow is inconsistent with a young Earth. So,
Okay.
I mean, to put it, I'll just put it, like not to put too fine a point on it.
Yeah.
You can make a bicycle in a day. That doesn't mean it happens in nature in a day. Nobody would expect a bicycle to be made by nature. And that's, a bit absurd, but you get my point that just because something can be done in the lab doesn't mean there's any set of natural conditions that could get it to happen that quickly.
Yes, I understand. Now I want to ask you about something I recently found out about as a Utah resident. My husband went to the Natural History Museum, and I knew that there were some exposed Cambrian rocks in Utah. And ever since, I keep hearing people say, "Well, if we found a rabbit in the Precambrian or whatever," I thought I need to go dig in the Precambrian and see what I can find. And I've actually been praying that God would let a rabbit be found in the Precambrian.
Destroy evolution.
Well, I don't believe that. I believe there would be, some explanation given to make it work. Anyway, like I actually don't think that there's anything that could be found that would actually falsify evolution in people's minds. And that's because we already have the scientific evidence against evolution, and yet it's still so widely believed.
Well, I don't agree with that, but okay.
Yeah, okay. Well, anyway, what I found out about, and I'm going to mute you temporarily because I'm getting feedback on your end. So I found out that actually there's an exposed Cambrian area called Notch Peak, and it's like up high. And so it kind of doesn't look like it matches like the stratigraphy that you would expect. Like you were like, oh, the Precambrian, is at the base of the Grand Canyon, and we can't really change that. But this like Cambrian area that's exposed is like, you know, it's not at the base of a canyon. And so anyway, I'm planning to go dig there this summer. If you want to come, Dr. Feldman, or anybody else wants to join, there is a place where you can go and dig for fossils, and I'm planning to do that. But what do you have to say? I'm sorry, I forgot to unmute you.
Okay.
What
Are you still getting feedback?
when I talk and you're not muted, then sometimes I'm getting feedback. So
Yeah, so there's uplifts, tectonic uplifts that can take deep layers and push them up high, but they're still in this area that's pushed up high, they're still in the correct order. So they're not out of order. So, there are marine fossils at the top of Mount Everest, and that doesn't violate anything. It's just that those marine fossils were uplifted by tectonic forces after they were deposited underwater. So there's no contradiction. What would be a contradiction is if you found, say, Cambrian trilobites in a stratigraphic layer that was above, Permian forams or something, and there was no fault in between. Now, creationists have claimed many times that they found these things, but there's always a fault there, and the fault has been always mapped before the claim was made. So, but within sections that don't have any faults in them, the stratigraphic order has never been violated. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't find new things that change our views a little bit, but not radically and not in any way that's significant. These footprints do push back tetrapods a little bit further than they were before, but it doesn't really violate anything. It doesn't contradict any theory of evolution that I know of. So, but we have to be open to new things, and that's one of the differences is that finding it's not just a Precambrian rabbit. I mean, you realize that's just a placeholder.
it's silly.
It would be any modern animal, any modern vertebrate in the Precambrian. Because vertebrates didn't even arise until later than that. I mean, especially terrestrial vertebrates. And so it's kind of curious that there's not even a footprint in the Precambrian, and yet there's raindrop imprints, and the preservation potential of raindrop imprints is pretty much identical to footprints. And footprints are common enough that I've been out in the field and found footprints in the when I was working at the Kansas Survey and did a lot of field work. I found I guess 2 really nice trackways when I was working in Kansas. So they're common enough that you can find them pretty easily. I mean, if I found them, they're easy to find. And yet no one, despite, 200 years of people intensely investigating it, no one has ever found any hint of a terrestrial animal in the Precambrian anywhere. And
well, you say this as if it's like something that should okay, I would need to understand why should we find that in the Precambrian? Like, just imagine for a minute the flood scenario.
Yeah.
And if we're talking about, sediments that are, ocean floor sediments, something like that, or, just basically base sediments where like nothing is there. Why should there be footprints?
Are you talking about the flood or pre-flood?
Well, it could be pre-flood. Okay. I mean, I don't know.
So when you look at the sedimentology and stratigraphy of the Precambrian rocks, which you assume are pre-flood in your world, the sedimentology says that there are lots and lots of river deposits and soils and terrestrial settings. I mean, raindrop imprints can't form underwater. They can only form above water. And so the evidence is that the environments are there. And so what kind of river has no animals associated with it and no plants? And
we've talked about this before, and still to me, I have a good explanation for that, which you reject. But I mean, underground water. No, water flowing deep underground.
No, but deep underground water doesn't form the types of sedimentology and stratigraphy. I mean, we see river bars and soils and river channels in the Precambrian, and underground water just doesn't do that. It doesn't move. Underground streams don't move sediment. They form caves or they form other things. But I'm not trying to I realize you have no formal training in this, but that just isn't a possibility. It's physically impossible to get the kinds of features we see. You can't form a soil underground. It can't be buried. It has to be at the surface. And the soils in the Precambrian are so well documented. No roots, of course, and no burrows. Soils today are intensely burrowed by insects mostly. But the oldest burrows in soils, I think, are in the Devonian. And so, when you go below that, you don't see any evidence of animals. And if it's the pre-flood world, like a lot of people like to think in creationism that the North America was intensely forested and inhabited by animals in order to get the coals that would then be, rafted up in these rafts and then deposited. But there's no evidence of that. There's not a single leaf fossil. I mean, there are some, some odd occurrences of pollen, but that can be contamination. A leaf imprint cannot be contamination. There's no way to contaminate a leaf imprint. And yet not a single leaf imprint has been found. And these are terrestrial deposits. Widespread soils channel. I don't know how you would form a river channel with a river bar underground. That just doesn't make sense, because we can actually tell the water depth by the sedimentology. And I use raindrop imprints a lot because it's an easy thing to understand, but there's a lot of more sophisticated sedimentology that we can use to say that we're right at the how deep the flowing water was in the river, and that occasionally it's subaerially exposed. So there's actually no taphonomic reason, no environmental reason why there wouldn't be any of these fossils in the Precambrian. So Precambrian rabbit is absolutely an excellent example. And the lack of Precambrian bones of any kind is a serious problem for creationists.
Well, can you see from my perspective why it's not a problem? Do you think it's just my lack of training that it? Okay, well, and then why are there so many geologists, young Earth geologists, that don't seem to have a problem with that?
Well, I've I've listened to I was just listening to Standing for the Truth, and Dr. Tim Clary was on, and he actually made a promise on the air to go out in the field with me, and then he's reneged. So he now is refusing. He said in that thing just maybe a week or two ago that there are no such things as river channels in the rock record, and there's no such thing as gullies. And there are tens of thousands of published examples of each in the rock record in the middle of what's supposed to be the flood. And so I don't know how you can have more of a disconnect than that. But he said so many things that are flatly false. And so that's where the disconnect is with the evidence. I mean, creationists like to say we're all looking at the same evidence, but we're not. We're not. And I've offered to take him out in the field and show him the river channels in the Morrison Formation and in the Cretaceous. And at first he said yes, and now he's saying no. So that's where the disconnect is basic evidence, and the evidence for river channels is so good. I mean, there are literally tens of thousands of published examples, and what's been published is just a small fraction of what's out there. But there are lots of river channels in the Morrison Formation, and the sedimentology it's not just that there are river channels. It's that there's three basic types of rivers today. There's meandering, braided, and anastomosing. If you don't know what those are, it doesn't matter. But the point is that we can see those exact same types of river channels in the ancient without any doubt. And people have even worked out, there's so many published examples that people have worked out how the different types of river channels change with the appearance of plants, because plants make the edges of the river channels more cohesive because the roots are holding the sediment together, and that actually changes the style of rivers. And we can actually detect that change through time. How can that happen in the middle of a flood? It can't. And the other thing is that there's no sedimentologic criteria that can be used to distinguish flood from pre-flood from post-flood. People have tried, but they always fail, and mostly they don't try. I've read Tim Curry's book in Carved in Stone, and he doesn't offer any criteria that could be used to distinguish it. There's no paleontological criteria. So, it just, and if you look at where creationists stand on where the boundary is, they're all over the place. They can't agree. Here it is, the most profound event in the Earth's history, other than the formation of the Earth itself. And yet it has no sedimentologic criteria, no sedimentologic record. There's no boundary that everybody can agree. There's no boundary.
Okay, but not agreeing on a boundary. I mean, look, if we're going to compare, issues related to this, I mean, evolution has way more problems with not being able to pin down dates and different things.
Well, no, I'm not talking about small amounts. Like Ken Colson, who has a channel called, I can't think of it. It's one of the prominent creationist channels. He thinks that the boundary of the pre-flood and flood would be at the top of the Paleozoic, perhaps. He's not sure, but he thinks maybe at the top of the Paleozoic. So we're talking about miles of sedimentary strata that people can't agree on whether it's flood or pre-flood, or flood or pre-flood. And the same thing at the top. So he's got a guest on who's a vertebrate paleontologist. This guy's on all the time. I can't think of his name. And he thinks that the top of the Cretaceous is the top of the flood. But if you go into the Gulf of Mexico, the top of the Cretaceous is something like 5 miles down, in 5 miles of strata, something like that. And so we're talking about differences of miles of stratigraphic column, not just a little bit here and there. And so it's nothing like what you're talking about for evolution. And the reason they can't agree on this is because there's no sedimentologically distinct criteria that distinguish the pre-flood from the flood. And so to me, and like the Green River Formation, there are prominent, like there's the, is Genesis History, do you know that channel? Yeah. Yes. So in that channel, they are absolutely convinced that the Green River Formation with all its wonderful fossil fish is post-flood. And a lot of other creationists look at the Green River fish as evidence of the flood. I mean, that's how far off they are. And the Green River Formation is thousands of feet thick. And so,
yeah, I hear your objections. I mean, to me, it like I said, when I'm comparing, okay, this seems like small potatoes that you're talking about compared to the problems with evolution and evolutionary dating and stuff like that. I mean, like I said, I showed on here, they moved the timeline 40 million years this year. So,
no, that's not a fair assessment. What a better way to state it is they found new evidence that showed the fossils are older. But when you stated that this contradicts the genetic timeline, I'm not sure that's true. I'd like to see the publication that substantiates that. But certainly they did find older fossils. And that does happen, from time to time, especially, with a lot more people looking at the rocks. And, they're going to push back the boundaries. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that there was any error in radiometric dating. It's just they found older fossils. But still, the fossils aren't out of order. It's not, this is just taking the earliest tetrapod and pushing it back a little bit. It's not finding a Precambrian rabbit. That would be a profound problem.
Right. But okay, I mean, the dating I'm talking about with the genetics is the molecular divergence dates. But yeah, we can talk about that another time, I guess, because I did find information about that, but I don't have it like handy with me.
And that's not, my area is really stratigraphy. And so to me, when I see river valleys and soils in the middle of what's supposed to be a worldwide flood that lasted 1 year, I say, well, how can you have a river valley that's hundreds of kilometers long filled with fluvial bars forming in 1 year? You can't. And then you have like 50 of them stacked just in the Pennsylvania. You can't do it. And so all the evidence that people say isn't there is, when so many creationist videos say that, all the layers are flat. You never see any erosion. Where's all the erosion? Well, it's profoundly present. I mean, I just led a group of petroleum geologists out when I so rudely canceled on you, and because I was exhausted. And there are outcrops where I take people to, as part of my work to show people these incisions. And from a petroleum geology perspective, they're very important because the river sands that fill the valleys are better petroleum reservoir typically than the sediments that are outside the valley. So mapping these valleys is economically important.
Well, I don't think they're saying there's never any erosion anywhere, but I will say my own observations, I've seen plenty of layers that are stacked on top of one another, no bioturbation, no marks of erosion, just straight up layers. I mean, I've seen that so many times. I don't even know, if I could count how many times I've seen that kind of thing. So, I mean,
Can
do
I
you
share my screen?
disagree with that? Sure.
Can I share my screen? I'm going to show somebody's name. Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay. What do I do?
Oh, you have to press the share screen button, like the screen down there with the plus
Yeah,
sign.
yeah, yeah. I see it.
But wait, is this going to be creationist bashing?
I'm showing a slide from a creationist video. I'm not altering it in any way. I'm just showing the words that he is putting on the slide.
Okay, that's fine.
All right.
And there's one more thing I really wanted to ask you about too while you're
Let me
here.
just do this, and then I'll answer any questions. So this is from a recent. Do you see my? Yeah. So this is from a recent screen. So let me just read what he says. I'm not going to alter it in any way. Waterborne sedimentary layers all over the world are as flat as pancakes without the necessary erosion, even if they were millions of years old. And then on top of this, he says, the waterborne layers all over the world are as flat as pancakes without the necessary erosion evidence if they were millions of years old. We don't see this. It's not there anywhere. And that is flat out false. There are thousands, probably tens of thousands of examples of erosional features that look exactly like what he's drawn here. And so his statement is false. And this is what bugs me, is because, these features are actually incredibly important for petroleum geology. And, I spent a large part of my career mapping these things. So I know they're there. And so, this is a pretty common statement that you see a lot. And it's not true. And it's not like it's not true just in a few cases here and there. It's the standard. In the Grand Canyon, there are examples of things that are flat. And there's lots of reasons why stratigraphy would be flat. If you look at sediments that are deposited in the marine environment, they're commonly very flat. And so it's not like, there's only erosion in certain places. And so if we look at stratigraphy that is in the middle of a basin where it was deep water, you don't get that kind of erosion. Then you go to the edge of the basin, you get it a lot, and you see a lot of these valleys. And so, like I say, I'm not exaggerating when I say there's thousands of examples of these things that are in the middle of what's supposed to be the flood. So what's your question?
Okay, now my question is about the dinosaur footprints, because we have so many dinosaur footprints in Utah.
A lot.
And now, look, to me, I'm like, so this is really strange because, like, these things, like, you can even tell the erosion in the last, like, 20, 30 years. Like, people have told me they used to be a lot sharper, and now, they're, like, kind of, like, flattening out and stuff. And so I'm like, how do we have all these dinosaur footprints exposed all over the surface of Utah? Like, what's your explanation for that?
Well, that's a good point. So I've seen a lot of these, and I've done a lot of field work in Utah. If people want to go see the dinosaur footprints, the two best places I know are just north of Moab. And there's no sign on what's the highway that goes north of Moab? Is it 191? And so about halfway between Moab and I-70, there's two dinosaur footprint sites. One is to the left and one's to the right. One's the east, one's the west. And one is in limestone and one is in sandstone. So let's talk about those. So the one in limestone, as I said, lime limestone sets up very quickly. It turns to rock, so quickly. And so if you have lime mud, that is mud made of calcium carbonate, and then dinosaurs walk on it. First of all, mud is cohesive, so when you step in mud and step off, it leaves a nice impression of your foot, even for a dinosaur, a really big dinosaur. And then the mud, because it's lime mud, can solidify really fast. And so it turns to rock in no time and can get buried. And once it's buried, then it doesn't erode ever again, so it has to get buried. The other set of footprints is in the Morrison Formation in sandstone, and this is in the tops of a river bar, and then it had to get buried rapidly. So to answer your question, the footprints that form and then get eroded away, we don't see them. So how would we know that they were even there? The only ones that we see are the ones that got buried relatively fast. And
but like the thing that doesn't make sense to me is that, if we're watching the erosion in real time, like in the last 30, 50 years, right? Like we can see the change, then why do we have these footprints sitting here? Like, why are they there? Because I mean, are these dinosaur layers that we're looking at? I mean, what's up with and then what are the chances of us being right here to view these dinosaur footprints as they get exposed? Like, how long have these rocks supposed to have been exposed? Because if those dinosaur footprints are already eroding in 30 to 50 years, then they're going to be gone within 1,000. So there's seems like a narrow time when we would actually be able to view these. So when did those layers get eroded so we could view those footprints? Final question, how did they get preserved where if there were used to be layers on top that got eroded, how did it erode so perfectly so that the footprints are actually preserved on the surface where we can see them in their detail?
So, there's a taphonomic bias here. So we don't see the footprints that form in areas that are eroding. So, the chance of preserving a footprint is relatively small. But once you get the right sets of conditions, then every footprint will be preserved. And so the right sets of conditions are you need sediment that is cohesive enough that when you push your foot in and pull it out, it'll preserve the footprint. Like if you try walking on just dry sand, it doesn't preserve footprints, right? It just collapses immediately after you walk away. But damp sand does a very good job of preserving footprints. And then you have to deposit mud on top of that. And so mud becomes shale, sand becomes sandstone. And so if you then erode it away, the shale preferentially erodes because it's softer and it leaves behind the sandstone with the nice footprint. But originally those footprints were filled with mud, which became shale. So it also happens the other way around, where the dinosaurs are walking on mud that became shale, and then the dinosaur footprint gets filled with sand. In that case, you have to look at the underside of the bed to see the dinosaur footprint. And just being here at the right time, yes, that's true. But if there's 100 different layers of footprints, every time is going to be the right time. At some point in some location, there's going to be footprints.
But is this the right layer? This surface layer that we're looking at, is that the right layer for the dinosaurs?
Well, the dinosaurs, there's lots of different layers in the Morrison Formation that have dinosaur footprints. I've seen them many times. So it's not one layer, it's many different layers. And if you have a surface that is eroding down, it's going to encounter that as that erosion proceeds, it will encounter, many different layers of dinosaur footprints. And so some of these footprints just get exposed recently from modern erosion. But they last a long time. Like the Paluxy River in Texas, those footprints were discovered, 70, 80 years ago, and they still look beautiful. And they get covered with river water every year. You can only see them in August or September because in the spring they're flooded. So yeah, so there's and so you can't look at what's happening in Utah today. There's probably no place in Utah that would preserve modern footprints. But I've gone to tidal flats where we like in the Bay of Fundy, and we dug down through the layers, and we could find like raccoon footprints, a foot or two below the surface, where they got buried rapidly enough to get preserved. So footprints are forming today. They're not, they're you can.
Yeah, I have no problem with the formation of the footprints. I'm having a problem with these footprints are on the surface of the ground, and this is supposed to have happened millions of years ago.
But most exposures don't have footprints. They're unusual, right?
Well, I mean, they don't feel that unusual here in Utah. And I mean, I've heard there's like thousands of footprints around the world. I mean, I'm hearing about these footprints all the time.
Okay, Rebecca, how many times have you been walking on a random place, not in a museum, not in a place that you knew had footprints, and found footprints for the first time? Has that ever happened?
No, not. I've only intentionally found them.
It's like going to a diamond mine and asking why diamonds are so common. Well, you're in a diamond mine. That's why they're common. If you go to a place that is known to have footprints, you're going to see footprints. But the vast majority of outcrops do not have footprints. I mean, it's a tiny, tiny fraction of a percent of the outcrops that actually have footprints in them. And the reason,
and I'm just trying to figure out what is the story for why we can see them right now? Like, how did they get dug out? Where it did, because like if I'm thinking about rock layers stacked on top of each other, right, then like I can see rock layers, okay, they erode, but then what happened to dig out the dinosaur footprints so that they could be seen on the surface?
Well, they just, like you said, if the dinosaur footprints are here, so imagine that there's dinosaur footprints here and here and here and here. As erosion goes down, it will encounter the dinosaur footprints and you'll see them. I don't understand why you think that's unusual. And of course, it only happens in a very few places. That's why dinosaur footprints are rare. I mean, they're rare in terms of when you find one, you usually find lots. But finding one, I mean, why do you think Paluxy River is so famous? It's because it's unusual. Finding dinosaur footprints is rare. I've seen a lot of them because I've done a huge amount of field work in Utah. And so I have encountered footprints in the middle of nowhere, and seen footprints that probably nobody else has ever seen. But it's the vast majority of outcrops, do not have footprints. So it's an unusual occurrence. And we know this because it's unusual. It's way under 1% of the outcrops that have footprints in them.
Okay, I guess let me put it another way, because I still am not really hearing like a good response, which is like, okay, so you have a footprint here. Now the footprint, so here's level ground. Okay, this is like solid rock. Okay, but I mean, you've got the little impression where the footprint is. Now, according to the evolution story, solid rock was on top of that.
Shale, okay. Which erodes very easily. So if it was just another layer of sandstone, you're right, you'd never see it. But you have to get the right juxtaposition of the hard layer below with the footprints and then the soft layer above. So shale is very soft. I mean, it's a rock, but it's very soft and it erodes very easily. And so what happens is you have shale that filled in the footprint, and then that erodes so easily, leaving the sandstone, which erodes, which is very hard. And so that's how it happens. Does that not satisfy you?
So the place near Moab that you were, sorry, there was a little bit of a cut, but the place near Moab that you were talking about, is it the dinosaur stomping grounds? Is that the place?
There's two locations that I'm familiar with. One is called Copper Ridge, and the other is called, I think, Miller Canyon. And if you look them up on the BLM websites, they have very specific directions. They're both, a few minutes off of the highway, but there's no signs. Unfortunately, there's no signs on the highway itself that tells you there's a dinosaur trackway site. So one site has maybe a dozen different trackways, not a dozen prints, but like a dozen trackways where the dinosaur was walking. Or maybe it has an alligator trackway too in one of the sites. And then the other site has two trackways, one from a sauropod and one from a theropod. And, the theropod footprints, these are the three-toed dinosaurs with the big claws, and it's probably 8 feet between successive footprints. So those are bipedal dinosaurs, and they're just, you can, when you see the distance between those footprints, you get an idea of how big the dinosaur had to be in order to make those footprints. So those are the two that there's probably lots of others that I haven't been to, but those are the two that I take students to.
The reason I asked is because I went to the dinosaur stomping grounds, and I don't know that it was sandstone that the footprints were in. I think, but I mean,
well, it's either sandstone or limestone. It has to be one of those two.
Okay. Yeah. Well, anyway, I just wanted to ask about that because I find that perplexing. If the dinosaurs lived so long ago, it seems much more likely to me that, they were just walking around not too long ago and made those footprints. And that's why we can still see them on the surface today.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the dinosaur stomping grounds. It's very close to where I was talking about, but it's not the same site. It must be a different site. But again, dinosaur footprints are rare in the sense of, you look at the percent of outcrop that actually has footprints, it's way under 1%. And what's interesting is when you go to the Permian, there's lots and lots of footprints in the Permian and Pennsylvanian, but no dinosaurs and no mammals ever. And so, we've got a nice succession of different types of animals that I don't think are explained by any creationist model. I'm familiar with the idea that you have these different biomes that are flooded successively, but that doesn't, when you look at all the evidence, that falls apart pretty quickly.
Yeah, I don't know. I see, and I guess for me, and maybe I don't know enough, but the flood does seem to pretty well explain the layering. Now, there may be a few things that are hard to explain that you brought up before, like, okay, why do we see what was the thing that with the wavy hump on the back, and it was like after the dinosaurs, pelycosaurs, right?
Yeah, what about them? I'm sorry.
Well, you brought that up as an objection. Why do we always find this particular order?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so the pelycosaurs, why are they in this order? Okay, so to me, that's a good objection. There's a few good objections about the ordering, but in general, to me, it looks like there was a worldwide flood.
I would say there are many, many worldwide floods separated by times when sea level was low and we get soils and river valleys. How do you explain the soils and river valleys in between all the flood deposits? I mean, it's not just that we find soils in the rock record, it's that we find the same types of soils that are forming today in different conditions. So we find different kinds of soils. And in fact, when they're mapped out, they map into climatic zones similar to the climatic zones we see today. So I don't think that works. If you just look at the marine deposits, yeah, but you have to, in order to get the flood model to work, you have to ignore all the terrestrial deposits, all the soils, all the river valleys, all the river channels. You have to ignore all of that to get the flood model to work. There absolutely is a lot of evidence for flooding, many, many times, hundreds of times, absolutely. But it's not one flood.
Well, about the rivers and all that you're talking about, for me, because I haven't actually seen that evidence. I can only take it based on what you're telling me. And so, and it's not that I don't believe you, but it's just, I have to weigh evidence, and it's hard to weigh evidence in that favor strongly if I actually haven't seen it myself.
Well, I can show you. Can I share my screen again?
Sure.
So I'm looking for I'm actually, you had invited me to come on. I actually am preparing a presentation, so I'm showing you parts of what I'm preparing. It's taking me a long time to do this because it doesn't earn me income, so it takes me a long time.
Now, Wes says hundreds of transcontinental floods. Yes, that doesn't stretch incredulity. So, like, and that's the thing is that, like, there's all these like mass extinction events and different things that to me it seems better explained by a flood. So, like the evolution requires all these mass extinction events and then all of these various floodings. So, like, isn't it just better explained by one extinction event, one massive flooding?
No, evolution doesn't require any extinction events, but we observe extinction events. The two big ones are the end of the Permian and the end of the Cretaceous.
Well,
So,
I mean, I mean, according to our observations, right? Like I'm saying, according to our observations. But you're right. Evolution doesn't require the extinction events. I mean, to make sense of the fossil record.
So here's a site in Kansas that I worked on. This is a long time ago. Maybe you can tell by the style of the car. And so where you see my red and white staff here, this is in the Pennsylvanian. And so my staff is actually sitting on the erosional surface at the edge of an ancient valley. So there's this is the South Bend limestone above it. This is the Stoner limestone here. And so I collected a series of cores across this valley. And so here's the incision. This is based on both outcrop and the cores. And so this surface right here is this surface right here. And the reason we can see this surface is because this area was excavated for vertebrate fossils. And so there's a vertebrate paleontologist who's published a whole series of papers on this. His name is Robert Rice, R-E-I-S-Z. Here's just a weird aside. Robert Rice, like 30 years ago, hired a fresh PhD grad student to be in charge of the excavations. And that guy lives around the corner from me, and he's the husband of my cat sitter. And so he was actually, I didn't even know that. I just learned that a few days ago.
Wow.
So, yeah, so he's actually the one who did the excavating here, or at least he was in charge of the team. But this has been recently excavated for the fossils. And so here's the valley. There's the valley right there. And, you can walk out like this surface. You can walk it out. Here's raindrop imprints. So that proves it was above sea level. Now, these all in this cross section, everything that's blue is a marine limestone. So these marine limestones extend for hundreds of miles. And so we know that virtually the entire state of Kansas, in fact, the entire Midwest, was flooded with, under marine water because it's full of marine fossils. And then sea level had to go down in order for this valley to be eroded. And there's actually soils on the edges here. And so sea level went down, the valley was eroded, and then sea level came up again. And there's another limestone that extends for hundreds of miles, the South Bend limestone up here. And we see about 50 of these cycles just in the Pennsylvanian.
And you have showed me this before. And so
Well,
I want to ask, what about this? Because to me, this goes very nicely with the idea of a worldwide flood.
In what way? So there are in the vertebrate, the terrestrial fossils only exist in these incisions. So we've got plant fossils, we've got there's insects and these kinds of things. I don't know if there's insects here, but in other incisions that look exactly like this, there's insects. And we've got the soils, and we've got the footprints. So let me show you the footprints. Sorry. There's the footprints. So that's also from this outcrop. These I got from a museum, but I've actually found footprints in this locality myself. So we know these animals were walking around. We know it wasn't underwater. And so there had to be time. So the limestone was solid at the time this erosion happened, because this is all limestone conglomerate down here. And so there had to be time to erode this valley and it's about that's 5 meters, so it's about 10 meters deep, 30 feet deep or so. And we've got all these cycles, and so all of these, and there's soils here, and it takes hundreds of years to form a soil, and so you just can't do this in a short period of time. I may have shown you something similar to this. I think I've got, I think these graphics are a little bit nicer now than they were in the past. And so, and the sedimentology of all the beds say they were deposited in either above sea level or by rivers. So we've got raindrop imprints, we've got footprints, we've got all the terrestrial fossils, and the terrestrial fossils in this area only occur in these incisions. And a lot of these incisions have absolutely no hint of marine fossils. So we know the conditions weren't marine. We know they weren't saltwater. So, and then to get this to happen, say 50 times just for the Pennsylvanian. And I'm not saying it's exactly 50, it's something like 50. So you have to have alternate periods of flooding. Like even in the creationist model, if these limestones covered nearly the full state of Kansas, where did the terrestrial fossils come from? Where did the animals that left the footprints come from? Were they washed in from hundreds of miles away and then still alive to leave their footprints? I mean, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I don't know, but like, again, I know that for you, this feels like a huge problem. For me, it doesn't feel like a problem.
Why not?
Well, because I mean, I'm seeing what, again, feels like the evidence of a flood. So, of course, I can't explain all the details of how such and such got formed, but you're saying we have marine layer here, a marine layer here, and when I'm thinking about the flood, I'm thinking about, oh, okay, like, that might be what would happen in a flood. And then, so you're saying, okay, but we have this erosion here. And so we know that, and all these things take a long time. Earlier, you told me it doesn't take a long time to form limestone. And it doesn't take a long time for limestone to harden. And I also just recently saw an article about rock hardening very quickly. And we know because it has like a coin in it with the date 1939. So,
well, you have to say what kind of rock. It's not just
right.
that rock forms fast. Limestone forms fast. Absolutely.
This wasn't limestone. I don't remember what it was, but it wasn't limestone.
Okay. Well, these limestones, who knows how fast they formed, or at least how fast they turned to rock. And they were certainly turned to rock by the time this valley was eroded. But in the middle of the flood, where did these animals come from? How did they get here and leave their footprints? You certainly don't think those footprints were formed underwater, and yet sea level had to be very high to form the limestones. And so sea level had to be high to form the limestones. Then it had to come down, and don't forget the soils. The Rock Lake Shale, which is right here, this thin little shale, gets thicker nearby, and there's a type of soil in there called a vertisol that we published in our paper. And vertisols take hundreds to thousands of years to form, and so you can't. This is where the time comes in, not in forming the limestone. The time comes in having sea level go down, eroding the valley, and then having the animals come in. So how'd the animals get there? In the radiometric time frame, this valley formed over the course of maybe 100,000 years. So it's more than enough time for animals to migrate into this area. So if you think that nearly the entire Midwest was submerged, and then sea level had to go down, the animals had to come in, but not dinosaurs, not mammals, just, the older reptiles only, and no angiosperms. And this has been studied intensively. Conifers, yes, and other lycopsids and sphenopsids. But how do you get them in there in a short period of time, and from where? Since everything was flooded for 100 miles in every direction, at least, and so if you only have a few days to do this, did the animals, were the vertebrates, the tetrapods, were they floating in the water and landed just there, just in the valley and nowhere else? I mean, it just doesn't, I don't think you can come up with a series of steps that will result in this happening about 50 times in the Pennsylvania. And it even gets harder than that. I'll just say one more thing. What we discovered is if you look at the types of soils and the types of valleys and the types of plants, we see climatic signals. So we see valleys that were very large that formed in wetter climates with wetter types of plants, and plants that preferred wetter situations, and soils that indicate higher groundwater tables. And then we see different kinds of plants in smaller valleys and drier climates. And so we see a climatic signal going on here. And I don't think you can do that in a short period of time either. So,
yeah, I mean, you might be right about these things. It's just hard for me to know. Wes says you need to have a conversation with another geology expert like Andrew Snelling. And I'm guessing the problem is that it's hard to get people like Andrew Snelling to have a conversation like this. Is that true?
That's right. I've offered, I've sent emails to Standing for the Truth, to Donnie, and he initially said he would invite me on, and we had a date set up, and then he canceled it. And he knows I'm available. Tim Clary, I've been actually emailing Tim Clary back and forth. He doesn't believe that any of these features are formed by rivers. I don't know he won't say what process he thinks formed them. And I've offered to take him in the field and show him the river channels and river valleys. And Donnie says he can't find anybody who's willing to come on the air with me to look at these features together. But what I see over and over again is creationists saying these features don't exist, or they're very rare, and they're not. And it's not just the incisions. You also have to explain the soils. And the soils are a huge problem because we know how soils form. We know the mechanisms that you need to get the soils to form. There's three mechanisms. One is the biologic, with mainly burrowing by insects. The second is chemical, where rainwater is just slightly acidic, and so it changes the chemistry of the minerals. And then the third is wetting and drying, which forms very specific structures in soils that don't form by any other process. So it's a very specific set of criteria that we use to identify these different soils.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, you might be right about everything you're saying. It's hard for me to know that. And so, like, Tom says this, and I feel like this is kind of how I feel about it. Geology is the weakest evidence either way, too many variables. I don't know, but so when I'm comparing ideas, right? So I can hear some of the objections you're saying and say, okay, this is interesting. This might be a good objection. But then when I take and stack next to each other the origin stories, like what are our options for origin stories, right? Even if everything you are saying is true, even if all of these are problems for the flood, to me, the origin story still fits with more of what we see in the world than the evolution story.
Well, you have to separate out two things. One is the stratigraphic and geologic evolution of the Earth and the age of the Earth. And then the second is evolution. So even if the Earth is ancient, that doesn't mean evolution happened, right? And so those are two completely independent lines of evidence. And so from what I know of stratigraphy, and for what nearly every geologist in petroleum that I've ever met, I've met a few that are exceptions, but the vast majority, the evidence we have does not fit a young Earth. You cannot get these features to form with a young Earth. The Noah's flood idea is violated by the evidence. And when I see, I've seen a lot of videos and I've read a lot of books on geology from creationists, and they get the fundamental facts, the fundamental observations wrong. And so that's the only way to construct that story. So Noah's flood, the idea that there's a Noah's flood that is that happened in a year that explains any part of the rock column is violated by the evidence that we have.
Well, and that I'm gonna strongly disagree with you about. Look, on these smaller issues that you're talking about, the rivers and picking out a particular place and saying, how did this happen? How did this happen? I'm not going to be able to respond to that, right? But when I hear you make a broad statement like the flood cannot explain all, the rock layers that we see, that seems to me to just not be a true statement, because we see the effects of water. We can see I anytime I get in a plane, I can see the effects of massive amounts of water. You see all these rock layers, you see all kinds of things that for me, I would expect if there was a worldwide flood, including the fact that we have fossils all over the world. So, in these sediments and including gigantic fossils like whales, right? Like, how does the whale get trapped in that much sediment? How does this happen? How do we have ichthyosaurs, you know, trapped in all these sediments and getting fossilized? It does seem that a worldwide flood best explains what we see, even if there's some issues that you brought up that we can't fully explain.
Well, these aren't minor issues. The soils are really important, and they occur in many places in the stratigraphic column. There's thousands and thousands of them, and if they each take hundreds of years to form, that kills the flood right there. I mean, it just does. I don't know. You have to ignore the soils and the valleys in order to get the flood model to work. Regarding ichthyosaurs, it's really interesting if you look at so in the taphonomy of fishes, and for the sake of arguments, the taphonomy of fishes and all the swimming vertebrates are the same, right? Because it's just it doesn't matter if it's an ichthyosaur or a porpoise or a fish, the same size. As long as it's about the same size, the burial process is the same, preservation process is the same. So for a small fish to get preserved, because the bones are so tiny, you really need to bury it quickly. There's really no other way to do it. As the organism gets bigger and bigger and bigger, you can have slower and slower deposition and still have it preserved intact. Like if you have a whale that's 100 feet long, fall to the sea, die and fall to the seafloor, those bones are so huge that even if it took 100 years for it to get buried, the bones aren't going anywhere. They're too big to be moved. And so it doesn't require really rapid deposition. And if you look at ichthyosaur and plesiosaur fossils and mosasaur, where they're really complete, and you really look at them carefully, there's a lot of evidence that they were buried slowly, that there's bones out of place. You can see parts of the skeleton where it's been messed with, where it looks like it's been scavenged. When I was the Solnhofen is a very famous deposit in Bavaria that I studied. I didn't study, but I went on some field trips there. And I was talking to a preparator who actually prepared the fossils. And he told me that for the Solnhofen, whenever he had a choice, like if there was a fish, he would always prepare the bottom side because it was invariably better preserved than the top side because it got buried too slowly. So the top side of the fish would get totally messed up. But the bottom side, because the scales were embedded in the mud in the seafloor, it was well preserved. So there's tons of evidence that these fossils are not buried that rapidly, especially for the larger ones. For the small ones, you have to bury it rapidly. But the larger, as the fossils get larger and larger, it does not require rapid burial.
Okay, so Wes asks, if this is so easy, do you have an example of a recent whale fossil?
You would have to get in a submarine and start looking on the seafloor, I guess. I mean, it would be extremely expensive to research that.
Yeah, I mean, or any fossil, like let's just say not a whale, but like, a recent fossil of a bear, an elephant. Like something that
Well,
we
the
could
only
say
place
happened in the past 1,000 years.
I'm sure there's elephant. Well, sure, absolutely. So there's a place. There's tons and tons of mastodon and mammoth and bison bones scattered across the Midwest. So there's examples.
Bones, but like are like we seeing, where in the world right now are we seeing animals being deposited and fossilized?
Well, do you mean vertebrates or animals?
Well, I mean, I was kind of talking about the big animals because we were talking about, so that I'll just stick with big animals like mammals, bears,
Well,
elephants,
it
that kind of
depends
stuff.
on it depends on what you mean by a fossil. I mean, if it's buried by 10 feet of mud, does that make it a fossil? I mean, it it, it gets it gets vague how you define fossil, but there's certainly lots of examples where there's been river cuts and the river is exposed an area where they found a mastodon or a mammoth or a bison or something. And the La Brea tar pits are filled with recent fossils, where animals walked into the tar. That's a little bit unusual because it doesn't occur very many places. But yeah, there's tons of places where you see this happening recently. Now you can't actually watch it happen because it happens over too slow a period of time. But you certainly can see animals. I've come across, just walking in the woods, come across the better part of a deer, just the skeleton just laying there. So it happens. It just has to get buried then to get preserved as a fossil. And so you have to be in an environment where that kind of burial happens. But then you don't see it. If it gets buried, you don't see it. So it's kind of a catch-22. But certainly fossils are forming today in vast numbers in limestone. That's like limestone that has modern bottles in it is packed with fossils.
Yeah, I guess it's just that like I don't see anywhere today that's having the massive type of sedimentation that we see preserved in rock now. Like, you know what I mean? We have like half the continent covered in a massive sediment layer that has tons of fossils in it. And like, where on earth do we see that kind of sedimentation happening? Like, that seemed like it was a very special event that preserved that.
Well, certainly in the past, there were times when most of North America and large areas of the other continents were submerged by the ocean. But certainly there are lots of places today where there's high sedimentation rates, like the Mississippi River Delta. There's high sedimentation rates that are every bit as high as what we see in the rock record. And so that's not a problem. When you look at the actual sedimentology of the beds, there is nothing unique about what we see in the ancient, with a few exceptions, like the asteroid impact at the end of the Cretaceous. That formed deposits that are unlike anything else that we see forming today. But when you look at the actual sedimentology, like the sedimentology of the units I was showing you, or the sedimentology of the sandstones or shales or limestones that we see, it's absolutely identical to the sedimentology that's occurring today on the coast. There's no difference. I don't know of anybody that's ever found a difference. Now, there are different fossils in them. So, today, like I said, I told you I was working on a modern tidal flat that had raccoon footprints in it. And when we look at the ancient, like in the Pennsylvania, we don't find raccoon, but we find, similar, reptile footprints. But it's the sedimentology is identical. I mean, when I say identical, I'm not exaggerating. It really is identical. So the sedimentology of the individual deposits is identical in every respect to the sedimentology of deposits we see forming today, but in different places.
Okay, because I just remember that was one of the things from Monte Fleming's book. I know you read this.
I did, and I'd say that he would be about the worst geologist I've ever met based on the quality of comments. Well, what do you want me to say?
I just don't want you to come on my channel and insult like people that I respect. That's all. I mean,
Well, he made a lot. I'll put it this way. He made a lot of false statements and a lot of unsupported statements in that book. When he said there's very little bioturbation in soils, that's not true. There's tons of bioturbation. When he talked about isostasy, from the way he talked about it, he clearly doesn't understand the concept. So, and this is my problem is I read books like that, like you suggest them, and I say, oh, I'll read it, and then I just get so upset because I see so many statements that are false. I mean, they're not even close to being true, and that's my problem. Is I see it, how do you want me to say it? I just see so many statements that are they're not just close. I mean, they're just blatantly false.
Okay, well, the point I was going to bring up from his book is where he discusses the difference in like the amounts of sediments that are happening. And, he talks about the few places where there's like, pretty large sedimentation happening, like Mississippi River and like the Ganges Delta, and that the sedimentation that's happening there is very small compared to the massive sedimentation that happened across the continents. So, like, what kind of thing would you say caused all the massive sediment layers that we see? That we know had to happen pretty quickly because they're like, they're.
I don't agree they happen quickly because
a large. Okay.
Sorry, you broke up there. Could you repeat that? You broke up.
Well, I mean, we know it had to happen fairly quickly, like not over millions of years, because it's all one sediment thing, and then there's animals trapped in the middle of that layer. So, like, what is your explanation for these massive sediments that are much more than what's happening at these river deltas?
So, a couple comments there. Again, you're ignoring the soils, which indicates slow deposition. If you have a stack of 200 feet of maybe 30 soils, and each soil took 100 years or hundreds of years to form, that's very slow. And so you're cherry picking the evidence for rapid deposition and ignoring the evidence for slow deposition. When you put it all together, you do need millions of years. And so, like with the Morrison Formation covers a huge area. The vast majority of the Morrison is non-marine. There are a few marine sections of it, and it's all rivers. So if we look at the Morrison in Utah and Colorado, the river channels are all more or less heading to the, I'm dyslexic and they're heading to the east. They're heading to the east. And so since all the channels are heading to the east and all the paleocurrents are heading to the east with some variation, we know that the land had to be sloping down to the east, right? Because rivers run downhill. And so then there was a mountain chain to the west that produced that sediment. So I did a little calculation for just one area of the Morrison. The volume, this is just an area that stretches from about a little bit west of Green River to about eastern Colorado. There's 14,000 cubic kilometers of sediment. No marine fossils in that particular unit. Everything is more or less heading east. All the paleocurrents and the channels are heading to the east. There was a mountain belt that was being uplifted called the Sevier Mountains. Those mountains have long since eroded. One of the complaints creationists have is if the Earth is that old, why do we still have mountains? Well, it's because new mountains pop up and old mountains are eroded down. The vast majority of mountain chains are long since gone because they've been eroded flat. And so that was the source of the sediment. And so when you look at all of the evidence for sedimentation rates, it's episodic. You get rapid sedimentation and then slow, then rapid, then slow. And we see this evidence all over the place. And what creationists do is they ignore all the evidence for slow deposition, all the bioturbation, and all of the soils. And the evidence for this is profound. But you have to know where to look, and you have to know what you're looking at. It does take training to know what to look for to see all this evidence. But it's not made up. I mean, it's real evidence. And so that's the explanation, is you just need time. And I did a calculation for the Mississippi River, and people have said, I've seen creationist comments that if you take the Mississippi River, there's not nearly enough sediment coming out, that even in an evolutionary time frame, you wouldn't have enough sediment to produce the sedimentary column we see in the Gulf of Mexico. And I did the calculations. Not an easy calculation to do, but I did it myself. And I came up, I think, with 80 million years for filling the Gulf of Mexico, which is about right. I mean, it's actually a little more than that, but it's not bad. And so these people that say that the sedimentation we have going on today is too slow to account for the volumes of material of sediment that we have, that's not true. It's actually not.
Okay.
Does that make sense to you, what I said about the Morrison?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like I said, it's hard as a non-expert to evaluate what you're telling me. So, but I do give you a level of trust because you have expertise in this area. So, like, I'm registering these things as objections to the flood model. But as I said, like, even if all of your objections are correct, it's when I'm still comparing models, it still leans to me in favor of the flood and, the creation model rather than, evolutionary processes.
Well, except for the soils. I mean, there are soils that take, most of the soils that we see in the rock record take hundreds of thousands of years to form. We know how soils form. And it's not just that we see soils, as we see the same kinds of soils that we see forming today in different climates or different conditions. And so that's a profound observation. And it's not just a fringe interpretation. This is an interpretation at the core of a lot of stratigraphy. So I think that if all I had was the soils, that would be enough to disprove the flood model.
Okay, so then, so for you, is there mixed evidence? What I mean is, like, is there anything that I've said or that any creationist has said that you've thought, okay, that's a good point, the geology is in their favor on that?
When creationists cite evidence for worldwide flooding, it's almost always true, but they're ignoring the evidence in between all the floods. So it's not one flood, it's many floods. And so there absolutely are times when a lot of the continent has been flooded. And I'm more familiar with North American geology than other continents. I'm a little bit familiar with parts of Europe because I used to lead field trips there. But so there's, it's they're cherry picking the evidence, and there is absolutely good evidence for flooding of nearly all of North America. But you have to ignore, in order to get Noah's flood to work, you have to ignore all the evidence for when sea level was low and how long it was low. And it's all those soils and river valleys and river channels that are problematic, and you need time for them to form. And
Okay, right. Yeah, I know. And you've said that many times. So I'm
because
saying,
you keep
okay, let's
ignoring it.
register. Well, I've registered your objection. Okay. So let's just say, okay, you've made that objection, and let's say you're correct. You are correct that soils are a problem, the river valleys are a problem. Okay. Is there anything, though, that you would say, well, that is a point in their favor? Not just, okay, yes, we see flooding, but is there anything that you've thought, okay, actually, that would fit well with the flood model?
There is no evidence I've seen that would fit the kind of Noachian time frame. There's no evidence that fits that better than it fits the evolutionary time frame. I don't even like that term evolutionary time frame because evolution and stratigraphy are different sciences. But let's just say the radiometric time frame. So I don't know of any evidence that contradicts the ancient time frame, and all of the evidence that I've seen cited by creationists for the Noah's flood time frame, they're cherry picking the evidence and ignoring other key evidence. So there's lots of evidence for worldwide floods. Absolutely. It's just not one.
Okay. Okay, so since you're separating it, I want to separate it. You're saying, okay, the old age, you're sure about that. But since you're separating that from evolution, can we go ahead and separate that from evolution? And then and I'm just being honest with you. I have an agenda. I want you to know the Lord. Okay. And so this is my agenda. I want you to know that your origin story is actually God created. And that's why you're here. So, is there anything like that would cause you to consider that? And I'm not even saying you have to get rid of evolution, although I think evolution is false. But what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I've told you before, I'm not going to talk about religion. I'm my goal, and the reason I come on your show and the reason I make comments on Donnie's show and others is because it just bothers me that people who are well respected in the creationist community are making so many false statements about geology. And that's really the core of what interests me. And I just want to set the record straight. That's my only agenda, is to set the record straight about the geologic evidence that we can look at and touch and observe. Look at and observe, that means the same thing. So I'm not going to talk about religion.
Okay, you don't want to talk about the religion. How about just about evolution? We're separating, okay.
Okay.
Give you your billions of years, but now let's talk about evolution. Like, is that something that you feel the scientific evidence is strongly behind? And we can maybe have a discussion on that.
Yes.
Okay. And so, I mean, you've heard me give objections. So what is for you compelling evidence for evolution?
Well, the general fossil record, the fact that we see a succession of different types of animals and plants through time that do not make sense with any other model. I think we can falsify the increasingly flooding different biomes. That can be falsified pretty easily when you look at the fossils in the context of sedimentology. And then there are, you've pointed out bats, and nobody knows the origin of bats, which is fair. But there are other fossil transitions that are gorgeous, like the fossil transition from what are called the mammal-like reptiles to mammals. And it's so gradational now that people don't even know, they can't even agree on where to put that boundary because there's so many intermediate forms. And so that's a really lovely transition. Another one is from dinosaurs to birds. So I remember I went to see a talk by Henry Morris. That's the right name, right? Henry Morris. Didn't he write The Fossils Say No, or is that doing Gish? I think it was Henry Morris. I went to see a talk by Henry Morris at Indiana University when I was a grad student. So this would have been 83, 84 maybe. And he was asked about Archaeopteryx and the evolution of dinosaurs to birds. And he said, well, Archaeopteryx is a bird and dinosaurs and birds are separate. And I remember what he said. He said, the difference is birds have feathers and dinosaurs don't. Then a few years later, lots of feathered dinosaurs were discovered. And he changed his tune. He said, Archaeopteryx is a bird because birds have flight feathers and dinosaurs don't. And now we have dinosaurs with flight feathers. It turns out there's two groups of dinosaurs that evolved flight. One became birds and one became, this other group that went extinct. This is a weird group of flying feathered dinosaurs. They actually have four wings. Both the arms and legs, so to speak, are wings. So they have four wings. And they have beautiful flight feathers. I mean, they're beautiful fossils of this group. And so now, it used to be that the morphologic distance was pretty large between dinosaurs and birds, and now that's closed. I mean, the fossils that have been discovered in the last 20 years have really closed that gap. So there's
I disagree with that. And, I'm not the only one. Do you know who Alan Fiducia is? He's a bird expert, and he has been basically canceled by the evolutionary community because he has spoken out about how evolutionists need to stop calling birds dinosaurs.
How do you spell his last name?
Feduccia.
Ah, I got it.
And also, I believe it was him that also did an experiment to show that these supposed feathers that we're finding on dinosaurs are actually the remains of like the like
Collagen.
cartilage breaking down.
Collagen. Yeah, and then I sent you a paper that completely refuted that. They looked at the exact same specimens that he looked at with higher quality photographs, more detailed, better lighting, and they showed that his analysis was incorrect. And there are so many fossils now that have not just feathers, but gorgeous feathers, where you can see all the details in dinosaurs. So that
Okay.
you're going to lose that one if you insist that dinosaur feathers aren't real. I'm
No, I
sorry.
mean, look, for me, there's no skin in the game on that because it doesn't really matter, right? Like, it doesn't matter what animals have what features. Like, animals can have any type of features, and in my world, in God's world, there's no rules about this type of animal has to have this and this type of animal has to have this, right? Like, there's no like limit on what animals could have. So I don't really care.
Yeah.
I'm just pointing that out, that there are people who are, speaking out against this, but Alan Fiducia's thing was more about the morphology. It's about the structures, the skeletal structures of birds versus dinosaurs.
Yeah,
So
I don't know what he would say now because in the last 10 or 20 years, there have been so many fossils found that really change the story that make it pretty solid. This is the book that I've been reading lately. So this is the 2024 version, and it has lots and lots of photos of fossils that has show the examples. So I mean, he might looking at this, he says that he thinks that birds evolved from the stem group of theropods rather than from theropods directly. So that would put it. But now there's so many fossils. I mean, there's so many feathered dinosaur fossils, and that study with the collagen is now completely debunked. So he was just wrong about that. If that I don't remember who was the author of that paper, but if it was him, he was wrong about it. So I mean, there are lots of feathered dinosaurs,
okay, well,
and so that's why. And it's also the order of the fossils. Like again, why are there no Precambrian rabbits or Precambrian teeth or bones or footprints or leaf fossils? I think that just is so tough to explain in a pre-flood world. The sedimentology suggests the conditions are ripe for preservation.
well, I mean, and again, I feel like, well, first of all, I will push back on the transitions and things like that, because I think what we actually see in the fossil record is a lot of sudden appearances. I mean, so
There are a lot, but there
yeah.
are also there are a lot of sudden appearances, but there are a lot of appearances that aren't sudden. Like Triceratops, that we talked about that a while ago. If you look at all the ceratopsians, they don't just appear out of nowhere. There's a whole succession, a whole branching tree of all these different ceratopsians that are becoming more innate and more horned through time. And so they don't suddenly. That's an example of an animal, a fossil that does not suddenly appear.
Well, I don't know. I mean, are you actually saying that, like, let's say you see the horns developing over, like, okay, this million years, this million years. Okay.
Yes.
I mean, that's interesting. I'll have to look into that. But, I mean, there are also just, I don't know, like, why can't there be different species or even the same species like Triceratops that have different size horns?
Well, they have ontogenic series, so we know, pretty much what an adult is. So we see them reaching different sizes, and you see them stratigraphically. If it was just, older or younger specimens, they wouldn't be arranged stratigraphically, but
Can
they
you
are.
give me an example of like a succession that we've found of Triceratops that shows the progression of the horns?
just look up, you can go into Google Scholar and do ceratopsian evolution. Ceratopsidae, I think, is the name of the family. But I'm not, I can't pull out the fossil names off the top of my head, no. But there's lots, and there are some nice graphics of this. I've been looking for one that has everything in stratigraphic order. The graphics that are needed to really show how it happens without the dashed lines, just to show things in stratigraphic order so you can see that. I haven't found that yet, but the data is there for sure. And so,
Yeah.
and I'm not saying that every fossil has a nice succession of forms that lead up to it, but there are many that do. And I think you're undercounting the number of examples where we do see the succession.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess like I think maybe I am, but what else am I missing? Triceratops, what else am I missing then?
Well, like I said, dinosaurs to birds is a good one. There's also within the dinosaurs, there are several different successions. I think the theropods leading to some of the apex predators like T-Rex. Another nice thing is that when you look at another argument for evolutionary time, here I'm saying it now, is when you look at the paleogeography of the Cretaceous, there was a seaway, like all the marine rocks in the Cretaceous are limited to the areas around the coast. And then this band of seaway that connected the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic. So there was like a seaway in the middle of the continent, more or less where the Rockies are today. So the Rockies weren't there. It was a deep ocean. And the dinosaurs that you see on one side are different than the dinosaurs you see on the other side. And so, and not every dinosaur, but like that's why T-Rex is only on the west side of the seaway. You never find it on the east side. And so this makes sense from a paleogeographic point of view and not from a creationist point of view. I mean,
Why wouldn't it make sense from a creationist point of view?
why would if the dinosaurs were all living before the flood started, why would certain dinosaurs be paleogeographically concentrated in one area? Because remember, where the layers of the dinosaurs, you go down lower and it's marine limestone for hundreds of miles. So they had to be, in the creationist model, would have had to have been transported in somehow from hundreds of miles away, and then transported in both in the evolutionary succession and in a geographic isolated succession. It doesn't make sense. I don't know how you would do that. Maybe somebody can come up with a model to explain that somehow, but I don't think it makes sense. And so the seaway model makes sense because then you have different evolutionary lineages happening on different sides of the seaway, and they can't talk to each other because the dinosaurs couldn't swim, 1,000 miles or 1,000 kilometers, not 1,000 miles across the seaway. I don't think anybody's going to suggest that, like a giant theropod like T-Rex could, cross an ocean. That doesn't make sense. And if you look at the relatives of T-Rex, they're all in an area where the land was all connected, and it's, you don't really see them out of place. So the biogeography makes more sense for evolution occurring. And when we look at the distributions of fossils, commonly the distribution of fossils, and this is what Alfred Wegener figured out in 1912, is that the distributions of fossils only make sense if you put the continents back together where they were at the time.
Well, see, to me, that makes sense with the creation model, right? With the idea of the flood breaking apart, the continents. So,
well, except that we see evidence that the continents separated and then came back together, then separated, came back together. And how do you get that in the flood? The flood, only looks at the separation and forming of the Atlantic Ocean. It doesn't look at the coming together of the continents and then separating, and the fact that this has happened many times in the past. If you look at the paleomagnetics of the Pennsylvanian, the equator in the Pennsylvanian time was more or less parallel to the Appalachians. So the whole continent was tilted. And this was, long before the formation of the Atlantic Ocean. And so when you put the continents back together in those times, it just doesn't, I don't see how you can get that to work in a 6,000 year time frame. I mean, there's all sorts of problems that crop up when you try to get that all to happen quickly.
I actually have not heard this before about the continents coming apart and going back together.
Yeah.
Like, wait a minute, I don't remember ever seeing this. Can you tell me about this? What is the evolutionary timeline teaching on this?
Well, there's tons of videos on this on YouTube. So just look
But what
up.
should I look up?
Let me see if I can find one really quickly. Just just do YouTube, look up plate tectonics. There's tons of them.
Okay, I'll look it up then. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
I don't have to look it up right now.
Yeah.
So
Just look up plate tectonics, and there's some of them have really sophisticated graphics, and some of them have absolutely horrible graphics. Here's one: Scotese plate tectonics paleogeography. Scotese is he's well known for making these gorgeous graphics that show the paleogeography at different times. And so I don't know how far. Let's see how far back he goes. Yeah, look at his video. It goes way. Yeah, he goes back before the Cambrian even. And so you see the continents coming together, coming together again. Yeah.
okay. Comment from Exo says, so far you have zero evidence for any evolution ever in all of history, and everything in reality actually contradicts any form of bioevolution or adaptation.
Well, I don't agree with that. I mean, I think it's not, most of the fossils don't show transitions, but a lot do. And so, the transition from mammal-like reptiles to mammals is probably one of the best ever. And I don't know of any paleontologist that disagrees with that. To the point where they can't even decide where the first mammal is, because the mammal traits show up so gradually and in stratigraphic order.
Yeah, but I mean, think about this story that you're believing right now for a minute.
I'm not believing anything. I'm stating a fact that this is what you observe. I'm serious. When I say that the mammal-like traits show up in stratigraphic order, that's an observation. That's not a belief.
Right. But just think about the whole story. Okay. Like, what you're believing is that physical and chemical processes, basically out of the dirt, water, rocks, something, life formed and then became diversified into all of these incredible systems and organisms that we see today. Like, does that really make sense according to our scientific observations? I'd say no, it does not.
Well, I'm not an expert on the origin of life, and so I just don't feel comfortable about it.
Look, I'll give you the first cell. Let's go beyond that. Okay. I mean, I shouldn't give you the first cell, but let me give you the first cell. Okay. Let's take it from the first cell. That cell didn't have eyes. That cell didn't have, nose, hands, heart, all of the things. Like, where are these things coming from? You really believe that chemical and physical processes, not directed, no intelligence involved, were able to put together these amazing systems?
I just need to check one thing. Sorry. I had a family obligation I forgot about.
Okay.
Just give me 1 second. I just need to make sure. Yeah, I'm okay. So, yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with all your complexity arguments. I don't think they work, but
why not? Give me a reason why that doesn't work. Give me a reason. Why should someone believe that these types of things that we see in life could come about with no intelligence involved?
Well, first of all, I think, natural selection is a very good process for creating more information. And so we know, I mean, people have come on your show and given examples of useful mutations. I mean, a lot of creationists like to say there's no such thing as that, but there are, and we've got lots and lots of examples now. And so the accumulation of useful mutations through time can build up complexity. I don't see any contradiction there. The one of the comments is that, well, you can't have two mutually dependent systems evolve at the same time, but I don't see why you can't. I you know I have I feel like I'm going out on a limb here because I just don't have enough knowledge about genetics and about how how DNA code works, because I'm not I'm not a geneticist. But what really drives me forward for a lot of this is that if creationism was true, why is it that every book I read on the subject is filled with false information? You'd think that if it was really true, you wouldn't need false information to support it. And yet that's why I keep coming back to that. And it's really hard for me to get over that. And so that's a lot of where I am. Plus what I see in the fossil record, the order of events that we see in the fossil record makes sense from an evolutionary perspective and does not make sense from any other perspective.
Okay, but we've already talked about the fossil record. We've already talked about how you're upset with the creationists for, their views and putting forth what you feel is false information. But that doesn't help evolution. You said natural selection, okay? Natural selection can only work for what is already present, meaning it can't select for something that's not there. Okay. And it can't help it along. It cannot help along. It can't direct. There's no, so you can't use, you can only use natural selection to keep what's there. So how did those systems get there? How did interdependent systems arise?
Well, first of all, to answer your first question, if you have a new mutation that wasn't there to begin with, and that mutation is useful, then natural selection can emphasize that mutation and spread it through the population. And so it can, with time, increase the complexity of the organism and create new organs. So that's how it happens. I don't see a contradiction there. It doesn't mean, I don't know enough about genetics to know whether how fast this would happen. But, new mutations can be useful, and natural selection can enhance the abundance of those mutations in the population.
Okay, so how do you envision mutations being able to bring about something like an eye?
Well, I think, this is one of those examples where Darwin really explained it beautifully. And so there are organisms living today that just have a few light sensitive cells. And so there would be a few mutations that would gradually develop light sensitivity. And of course, at every stage that would have to be useful, because evolution can't see ahead. It can't see ahead that it's going to make an eye. It can only do what's useful for that organism. But you can see how, because we can look at organisms today that just have a few light sensitive cells, that this helps them live their life and reproduce and such. And then those cells can be in a pit that helps them to develop a better image of light and dark. And then that pit develops complexity. And so the complexity evolves through time into an eye.
Okay, would you accept that explanation if I gave that explanation for how a camera came about by natural processes?
No, because we know how cameras are made.
Okay, well, yeah, but cameras require intelligence, right? Would you accept that? So, putting aside that you know how cameras are made, would you accept a camera-like thing coming about by natural processes?
Well, I think our eye is a camera-like thing.
Yes, it is. And so think about what would you told a story. Okay, you're telling a story about how this can happen,
How
right?
it could happen. That's right. I mean,
Okay.
we don't have the evolution. We don't have the fossil evidence because eyes are soft parts and they, don't get preserved, and so we don't see those stages. But though that's how it could happen. Yeah.
Okay. And it may not feel like a wild story to you, but it is a wild story. It's an absurd story considering all of the parts of the eye that have to work together for you to be seeing right now. I know it's a tired example because everybody loves to talk about the eye. I do like to talk about the eye because right now you're using your eye and you're getting images, and those images, it's not just about getting the eye. Your brain has to be able to process those images. And you're saying,
but we have organisms that are alive today that have all the different stages to creating an eye. All the intermediate stages exist today in living organisms. So where's the problem?
well, I don't think that we have all of the stages. Okay. Yes, we can see some organisms that may have a simpler eye than what you have, right? But
Far
no,
more,
we do not have all of the stages.
well,
No, that's ridiculous.
it's not
And
ridiculous.
and what you're talking about, see, evolution has to build with mutations, right? So, but do you realize how many mutations we're talking about when we're
Well,
talking about an eye? Okay, well, let me just give you an idea because it's not just one gene that's making your eye, but even if it was just one gene, that one gene is thousands
yeah.
of bits of information. So you're talking about thousands of bits of information that just so happen to coordinate. And that I'm just using one gene, right? But you're going to need many genes for sight. Okay. So, but one gene is thousands of bits of information that had to be mutations that coordinated in just the right way, like to work cooperatively to get, one part of your vision. So,
I don't agree with that. I
and
think
not only that, even if you got the bits of information via mutation, right? And mutation was somehow able to, without any intelligence at all, get a bunch of stuff. That's like saying letters, that you could just shake a box of letters and then, it comes out with, a couple thousand word essay, right? So, but let's just suppose that happens. You have to have an army of machines to actually put that into action to start working toward your vision. So
I don't agree that it can. I think, given enough time, it can happen gradually. That you just need one small change at a time, building complexity gradually. And so you don't need the coordination because you're only building one small part at a time. What coordination do you need to have a few light sensitive cells and a nerve to detect them? And then you can put those cells in a pit, and then you can build a lens. And so everything is building on top of it, and it has the appearance of design, but it's not intelligent design.
okay. Well, what I mean by you have to have an army of machines is that in order to transcribe, even if you got the genetic information to be able to do that, and it would be multiple genes, not just one. So if you're talking about building from a small, a light sensitive cell or whatever, then you're going to have multiple genes coordinating. Okay. And so where is the coordination? Then in order, like you have to get the bits of information, then you have to have an army of machines to transcribe it. When your DNA gets transcribed, then there's like so many steps in the process. You have a spliceosome that comes and messes it.
I can't answer that because I just don't have the expertise in that area. I mean, I'm at the edge of what I feel comfortable talking about because I lack the expertise of how that works. So I can't. I mean, I have a lot of expertise in geology and paleontology, but I'm not a geneticist. I'm not a chemist, and so I can't. You're asking me to go out on a limb on things I don't understand, and so I don't feel comfortable talking about it. And frankly, I'm not going to take the time to learn it.
Okay, and that's fine. You know what? Actually, because I don't even think we need to go there for you to realize evolution is wrong. We can just look at what you do know. Like
Okay.
just at the structures that you're aware of. I mean, consider a seed. You know, this is not going outside of your expertise. You know that you can put a seed in the ground. First, the seed can remain dormant for who knows how long, ready to spring to life under the right chemical conditions. It can come up and, you know, usually make something that's many times the size of itself and build an entire plant that can reproduce itself. So that's an incredible system. We've never built anything like that. With all of our human intelligence combined, we've never made anything like a seed.
I
A
agree.
single seed has more, you know, capacity, storage capacity than anything we've built.
Okay.
So what you know, how is that coming about with no intelligence involved?
Well, it's the same question as the eye, and I just again I don't have the expertise on the on how DNA works and genetics and the code and all of that, but it's the same exact question as the eye.
Yeah, I know. And we could look at many examples,
Yeah.
and there's not going to be an evolutionary explanation that's going to actually make sense of
Well, I
what we
can't
see.
answer that question because I don't know what the I don't know about the biochemistry of evolutionary explanation, so I can't answer whether that's true or not because it's not a topic I'm familiar with.
Well, it's something right now you're trusting the story, right?
No, I'm trusting the fossil evidence, the fossil record. That's what I'm trusting. The evidence that I am familiar with and that I've studied. That's what I'm trusting.
Okay. Well, we all have a choice about what we're going to put our trust in. And
Well, I
for me,
trust
yeah.
in things that I can see and feel and measure. And the fossil record that I've described isn't an interpretation. This is the order of the fossils that we see, and it's by far a strong evidence for evolution. It's not just a hodgepodge of fossils, and that's why I keep coming back to it because that's the topic I know.
Yeah. And I appreciate that. I appreciate you wanting to stick to your area of expertise. So,
Yep,
well,
I think we're done. I'm tired.
yeah,
It's
me too.
9:30.
I've been going almost 3 hours. So
Oh my!
thank you so
If we've been on that long? Oh my
much for
goodness!
watching, everybody. Have a good night.
All right. Good night.
Yep. It's time to end. I wanted to get to the comments. I'm sorry. Thank you all for being here and for your great comments. Appreciate
Do you
all
want
the
to ask?
support. Take
Is there
care.
any comment like at the highlight high that you want to ask or anything before we go? Like I'll take one more
Well,
question.
there's a lot of comments. So
Pick a good one about geology.
pick one about geology. Okay. That we might have to go a little bit far back, so it'll take me a minute. So okay. Yeah. I think we should just give it up for tonight.
All right.
All right.
Good
Thanks,
night.
everybody. Appreciate you. Good night.